Okay, let's jump right in. Today, we are unpacking a genuinely provocative, frankly mind-bending set of predictions about Nigeria's political future. We're diving into the latest thesis from investigative journalist David Hundian. Whether you follow his work religiously or you're just trying to get a better grip on African geopolitics, his take on the upcoming 2027 Nigerian elections offers a totally fascinating, entirely different lens through which to view how power actually works. To really understand where Hundian is coming from, we have to start with this incredibly stark quote. He argues, right out of the gate, that it almost doesn't matter what the actual election result is going to be. On May 29, the incumbent is going to be sworn in for a second time. He's basically saying the 2027 election is a completely foregone conclusion. It's insulated entirely from the actual votes that everyday people cast. So why is he so convinced of this? Well, we've structured this explainer into 6 clear parts to break down his logic. We'll hit the 2027 election paradox, the fractured political opposition, the foreign influence factor, erased history and continuity, the trap of resilience, and finally, rebellion or nostalgia. All right, let's start with part 1, the 2027 election paradox. The big takeaway here is the massive gap between what we see on the news and what's actually happening behind closed doors. On the surface, political maneuvering in Nigeria just looks like your standard, run-of-the-mill ego clashes between ambitious politicians. But Hundean argues that those surface-level fights are actually a smokescreen. They mask a deeper system where unseen hands are essentially stage-managing the entire sequence of events. And yes, that includes managing the opposition itself. Which brings us to his first major piece of evidence. Moving to part 2, a fractured political opposition. Looking ahead to 2027, the political opposition is, well, it's a mess. Instead of unifying against the incumbent, the opposition is split 4, maybe even 5 different ways. You've got figures like Peter Obi, Atiku Abubakar, former President Goodluck Jonathan, and Governor Shalmaki all thrown into the mix. And Hundean argues this is absolutely not an accident. This kind of fragmentation gives the ruling party the perfect, believable cover story to sell to global media platforms like Bloomberg. They can just throw their hands up and say, hey, we didn't rig anything, the opposition just divided their own votes. And because of all this deep disillusionment, Hundean makes a truly staggering prediction. Just 10 million. In a country of hundreds of millions of people, he believes the entire 2027 election might be decided by a mere 10 million votes. Why? Because voter apathy is going to be historic. People just feel the outcome is completely locked in anyway. That takes us to part 3, the foreign influence factor. You really have to look at how political parties actually come together to understand this next point. The source notes that organic political movements, take Kenya's ODM for example, which has decades of real grassroots history, are fundamentally different from Nigeria's ruling party, the APC. He actually describes the APC as a special purpose vehicle that was just rapidly cobbled together around 2013 and 2014. And his most controversial claim? He alleges this entire vehicle was heavily orchestrated by the U.S. State Department just to create a compliant, friendly regime. According to this thesis, the current president essentially acts as a kabuki theater leader. He gets to keep his grip on power, but only by following specific instructions from these foreign backers. Hundean points to alleged concessions like permitting a permanent U.S. military base in Nigeria for the first time, rolling out harsh Chicago school shock doctrine economic policies, and rapidly yanking away social subsidies without putting up any fight. The idea is the incumbent gets the fancy title while foreign interests get exactly what they want. But you have to wonder, how on earth does a nation's populace just accept this? Let's look at part 4, erased history and continuity. It literally starts in the classroom. Hundean absolutely goes after Nigeria's 6334 education system, arguing that it actively strips out all the vital context from the national narrative. History is taught in these weird, disconnected silos. So instead of showing kids an unbroken chain of cause and effect, they're just handed isolated facts hanging in a vacuum. It makes it nearly impossible for anyone to actually understand how the country arrived at its current political state. And understanding that historical continuum is totally crucial to his argument. He asserts that modern Nigerian politics isn't a fresh start. It's a direct continuation of the past. For example, he points back to the Gowon era in 1966, claiming Gowon actually had an MI6 handler. Then he points to the Babangida era in 1985, which he says officially normalized the criminal underworld's entry into politics. Basically, Hundean is saying you simply cannot understand today's administration unless you realize it's the direct successor to the corrupt systems built decades ago. And the perfect, tragic example of this erased history, Fela Kuti's mother. Historically, she was an absolute powerhouse, a fierce anti-colonial campaigner who mobilized women into the liberation struggle. But Hundian points out that in Nigerian schools today, her incredible legacy is totally sanitized. She's reduced to a trivia question: the first woman in West Africa to drive a car. By actively minimizing that revolutionary history, the system successfully shrinks the population's own revolutionary potential, which leads to a massive psychological shift today. Which brings us to part 5, the trap of resilience. Normally, we praise resilience, right? It's a good thing. But Hundian completely flips this concept on its head. He argues that in the Nigerian context, calling someone resilient is actually deeply insidious. It's basically a polite euphemism for knowing how to suffer. It means you are cheap, you are exploitable, and you're so utterly accustomed to living life on hard mode that you've literally normalized your own pain. And think about it. When you normalize your pain, you stop demanding better from the people in charge. To really drive this point home, he shares this fascinating anecdote about tech startups in Nairobi. Apparently, some founders will actively avoid hiring Kenyan developers because Kenyans demand higher wages that match their high standards. Instead, they seek out Nigerian developers. Why? Because that normalized resilience translates directly into desperation. A Nigerian developer will deliver the exact same phenomenal standard of work, but they'll do it for a fraction of the cost. It's a glaring example of how a traumatized national mindset gets directly exploited on the global market. In trying to snap people out of this mindset, it doesn't always work. Hundian talks about this Al Jazeera interview he helped set up with presidential advisor Daniel Bwala. The whole goal was to subject the advisor to intense, brutal international scrutiny. He wanted to trigger national shame, hoping it would finally spark some outrage back home. But it backfired. The domestic audience totally missed the point. They actually thought Al Jazeera, this foreign media network, was stepping in to fight the Nigerian government on their behalf. The intended wake-up call just completely fizzled out. So, if the system is really this entrenched, what exactly happens next? Okay, our final section, part 6, rebellion or nostalgia. If a fractured election isn't going to change anything, what will? Well, Hundian doesn't mince words. He states that the only real alternative to this suffocating political apathy is a visually spectacular critical mass event. We're talking a nationwide rebellion or a massive general strike. In his view, just tinkering at the edges of the ballot box is absolutely never going to displace the current leadership. But that actually brings up a really ironic question that someone posed directly to him. If he was absolutely forced, gun to his head, to put a thumbprint on a ballot in this deeply flawed system, who would he actually vote for? His answer, former President Goodluck Jonathan. Now, it's super important to note he isn't framing this as some glowing political endorsement. It's a choice driven purely by nostalgia for a time before things got quite so economically desperate. Plus, there's this faint geopolitical what-if. He harbors a tiny hope that Jonathan, having learned the hard way from his removal in 2015, might actually have the foresight to seek out alternative geopolitical alliances, maybe aligning with Russia to counter Western dominance. Zooming out to look at his entire thesis, the overarching conclusion is incredibly sobering. Hundian posits that since gaining independence in 1960, with the exception of a couple of very brief anomalies, Nigeria has essentially never experienced true sovereign leadership. Real, unpuppeted control just hasn't existed. The nation's trajectory has just been continuously managed by external forces leaning on compliant internal actors. So we're left with this massive, unavoidable question. Will the populace just continue indefinitely enduring this trap of resilience we talked about? Or is a critical mass rebellion literally the only viable path forward to achieving actual sovereignty? It's a powerful, unsettling thesis that completely upends how we normally look at political analysis. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped clarify a deeply complex topic, and I will catch you next time as we keep breaking down the most fascinating ideas out there.